Welcome to everyone to our second session. My name is Arthur Zients. I'm the other Arthur. I don't think you'll be too confused. Allow me to begin by thanking Arthur Brooks and the AEI for their kind invitation to join this distinguished group of presenters this morning, and also a very distinguished audience, in order to explore themes of deep importance and common concern. Your Holiness, as always, it's a great pleasure to also be working once again with you, as we have over many, many years. It's been a source of great happiness and flourishing, you could say, for us to be in dialogue with you for now nearly 30 years. Many of you have asked, what is the Mind and Life Institute? I think I should take just a minute to say a word or two about it. Back in 1987, His Holiness the Dalai Lama was joined by a neuroscientist, Francisco Varela, and a businessman, Adam Engel, in a kind of common interest and enterprise to join the best of the sciences of the day, what it is that neuroscience, physics, astrophysics, consciousness research could bring to the table in the conversations with the great contemplative traditions of Asia, traditions which also explored the nature of the mind and the nature of reality around us. And so those conversations would last 5 days. 5 days. You've got a couple of hours. Imagine sitting in this very small room, his living room, for 5 full days of dialogue on the most esoteric and interesting and important subjects of our time. Done not out of curiosity, but out of the conviction that ignorance is the source of suffering, and that if we can come together across normal divides, the schisms between science and religion, which go back centuries, if we can bring those broken parts together, then perhaps together the insights and wisdom will arise that really is necessary for our time today. We came together not out of just idle curiosity or only out of friendship, although those were also there, our interest in friendship in each other, but also our animated concern for the well-being of our both individual community and ultimately our planet. And so Mind and Life's work from that early beginning has spanned now nearly 30 years. In 2003, we made our first public offering at MIT, called Investigating the Mind, where we studied attention, emotion, and mental imagery. We did so with a full array of the world's most foremost scientists, psychologists, neuroscientists, and the like, and likewise, on the other side, the contemplative scholars and practitioners drawn from various traditions who could then work together in public around this same theme of bringing these two worlds together, a kind of undivided life for the first time. We've had 27 such dialogues, many in public, many still in private, and out of that have come over 15, I think it's now 18 books, 4 still in production, a wealth of publications. But most recently, our work has also begun to take an applied turn. That is to say, not only are we looking at the basic research that underlies human well-being and flourishing, the alleviating of suffering, but actually, Mind and Life has now begun to actually work in the fields, for example, of education, secular ethics, which is so close to your heart, working in the area of craving, desire, and addiction, working in the area of mapping the human mind, inviting visiting scholars into our Amherst College house, and working with them as well as with 150 young people every summer for the last 10 years. I mean, one thing after the next, and it's really flown from this very fertile dialogue with you, Your Holiness, and with the kinds of people you'll experience on this stage today. You know, when one begins a practice, a meditative practice, as Daniel Loeb said, we begin with an intention. What is our purpose in doing this? Is it selfish or is it selfless? Do we have in mind the connections, the compassionate connections between all of us that link us one to another? Again and again, His Holiness has re-articulated that interdependence as central to our ethical lives. I'd say this work, the work here we're doing today, must also likewise have that intention. And so we enter into this dialogue with good spirit. You've articulated the same kind of intention at the very close of your summation. So let us begin also the second session with the same heartfelt theme in mind. We're here because we care. We're here because we care. Can we care enough? Can we find the means and methods that we can care for one another? Let me introduce to you the people who are on stage with me. Dear friends all, of course there is Professor Richard Davidson, known to you for many years, Your Holiness, as a professor at the University of Wisconsin and the director of the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds. He'll be leading off with a careful scientific treatment of the study of happiness and well-being, human flourishing based in the neurosciences and psychology and its implications for education. Our second presenter was for 14 years president of Wellesley College, Diana Chapman Walsh. Diana is also on the executive committee of MIT's board of directors. She was the founding board chair of the MIT-Harvard so-called Broad Institute for Genomic Research, woman of extraordinary leadership, in fact, chairing our leadership effort, so-called Academy for Contemplative and Ethical Leadership at the Mighty Life Institute. And finally, we have an added new participant, Otto Scharmer. Otto works at MIT and is the founder of the Presencing Institute, and he'll be speaking to the themes of leadership, mindfulness, and the new kind of thinking that can work in the complexities of our contemporary society. I'll be acting as the facilitator, and it's a pleasure then to ask Richard Davidson to begin our discussions.
Thank you. Wonderful to be with you again, Your Holiness. And I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude to Arthur Brooks and the graciousness with which the AEI has received us, and it's really been an exciting collaboration for us. So thank you. I'm here to talk about happiness and well-being, and over the course of the next few minutes, I'm going to make several distinct points about happiness and well-being from a scientific and particularly a neuroscientific perspective. So to begin with, scientists are now distinguishing among different components of happiness and well-being, different varieties of happiness and well-being. Happiness, the subjective sense of pleasure, we think now is something distinct from well-being, which we define more in an Aristotelian framework that has been described as eudaimonia, which is imbued with qualities such as meaning and purpose in life, having positive relations with others, having a sense of personal growth that is being open to change. All of these are constituents of well-being that have been studied in both the psychological and neuroscientific literature. And one of the most interesting conclusions from this scientific work is that the fleeting experience of happiness is subserved by different circuits in the brain than a more enduring quality of well-being. So that's the first point, that happiness and well-being are distinct. The second point is a point about genetics. And this is, I think, a very, very important point because I believe that modern research leads us to a different view of this. According to the most recent, very large-scale studies that have, these are studies that combine across studies. We call them in the scientific literature meta-analyses. These studies show that somewhere between 20 and 40% as we say in science, of the variance, and I'll explain that in a moment, but 20 to 40% of the variance in well-being is accounted for by genetic factors. Now, what we mean by that is that differences among people in their level of well-being can be attributed somewhere between 20 and 40% to their genes. These are heritable factors. So what conclusion can we draw from that? Can we draw the conclusion that somewhere between 60 and 80% is changeable? That is the percentage that is caused by our genes something that is immutable, something that cannot be transformed? And here I would like to introduce the subject of epigenetics to the audience. And epigenetics is the science of the regulation of our genes. And epigenetics teaches us that each of our genes has a little volume control that can go from low to high. And that volume control affects the extent to which different genes are actually expressed, the extent to which genes manufacture the proteins for which they are designed. So we know, for example, that we can take an organism which may have a genetic propensity for anxiety based on its genes, and if it's raised with a mother who is very loving and very nurturant, the very expression of the genes that are involved in anxiety are transformed. So that it doesn't matter that there was a genetic predisposition for anxiety in that case. The environment has actually altered the expression of the genes which are critically implicated in anxiety and shift that regulation. And so from this perspective, the fact that a certain amount of the variance in our well-being is accounted for by genes really should not be a relevant consideration in discussing the potential impact of training and regulating the environment in its effects on our well-being. So what are the factors that can promote increases in well-being? Well, Arthur Brooks has actually talked about four, which I think are wonderful. And the four that Arthur Brooks notes are faith, family, community, and work, all of which I think there actually is substantial empirical evidence to show that they, in fact, do play a role in fostering our well-being. And from the research, the modern research literature, there are two particular factors that I would like to highlight. They're more granular, if you will. They all can be affected by the four factors that Arthur Brooks described, but they are generosity and conscientiousness. Generosity and conscientiousness. Both of these turn out to be very important in the fostering of well-being. And actually, His Holiness has written about secular ethics in several books, and His Holiness talks about the ethics of restraint, the ethics of virtue, and the ethics of compassion. And I think of conscientiousness as being impacted by the ethics of restraint, and generosity being impacted by the ethics of virtue and the ethics of compassion. And so I think that there is some interesting parallel between the Buddhist framework and the conceptions that we're coming up with in modern science. But I'd like to now turn to the notion that measures of conscientiousness and generosity and other factors that are associated with them early in life are very good predictors of an individual's development over the course of the early decades of life. Specifically, research indicates that a child's capacity for certain kinds of conscientious behavior when they're 4 and 5 years of age predicts outcomes when they're 30 years of age, major life outcomes, including economic success, but also drug abuse, physical health, and characteristics that are really meaningful for living a life that is filled with flourishing. So the question that we can now then ask is there a possibility through education to actually alter these qualities that are so central to well-being early in life? And here is where we appeal to the notion of neuroplasticity, the idea that the brain actually is the organ in our bodies that is built to change in response to experience and in response to training. And we know from neuroscience that there are sensitive periods in development where the brain is particularly sensitive to change. And we know that one of those periods spans the entrance into schooling. It's between 4 and 7 years of age. And so the question that we and many others and Mind and Life is taking on is, can we develop strategies, interventions, curricula that are targeted to this early period, which may then actually foster the qualities like generosity and conscientiousness, which are so important to flourishing over the course of development. And we're beginning to get an answer to that. And the answer suggests that there is absolutely no doubt that these factors can be educated. And they can be educated in part because of our understanding of plasticity in the brain. We can shape the brain during these early periods of development particularly effectively. In our own research, we have shown gains of 20% on measures of delay of gratification from a simple curriculum that we've introduced in the preschool period. And this measure of delay of gratification is an important element of self-control and conscientiousness. So we're led then to the conclusion, and I'll just summarize here. There are really 3 points, major points that I've made. One is that well-being can be learned. And from this, we should think of well-being and flourishing more as a skill than as a characteristic that is just fixed within us. The second is that from neuroscience, we know that the brain is particularly plastic during these early periods of development. And so we could take advantage of these sensitive periods to design interventions in curricula to educate these qualities, to educate generosity, to educate conscientiousness. And the third is that early interventions provide a great return on investment. And the Nobel laureate economist James Heckman from the University of Chicago has calculated that for every dollar that we invest in the preschool period, there's a return of $7 on that investment by the time the individual is 30 years of age. And so I believe that this is an issue that all of us, from all political persuasions, should get behind and establish universal education during this period of time where we can really educate the heart in ways that will make a fundamental difference when children develop. Thank you.
Thank you. Your Holiness, we'd like to take a few minutes to pose a question that draws on what it is that Richie just spoke about. He speaks about the benefit of education and training of those qualities and characteristics such as generosity and conscientiousness and compassion. Could you speak from your perspective, from this perspective of a practitioner yourself, what kinds of education and training would you recommend be adopted in order to promote just these qualities in children and young adults?
My longtime friend, you mentioned, you see, because of the level shugin theaterlo chunjukabdo de.
Richie mentioned about the sensitive period of 4 to 7 year old.
So I just want to know further more. My own case, I think 3-4 years is no interest about these things. And even I think 7, 8, around 10, you see, no interest, you see, about so the inner values, these things. So actually, my daily lessons start more worry.
Classes.
Classes, like that. So great reluctance there. Then age 12, 13, 16, that gradually more interest develop. So it's thinking, or the certain sort of idea mentioned in the text, and make relation with your own sort of the experiences. Then my age, I think, late 20s and 30s, 40s, I think the more rigorous study and analyze or contemplation. So really effect. So that means effect.
So the sensitive period doesn't seem to be limited to just to young early childhood. It's only saying that even as a grown up, there seems to be hope.
There are other sensitive periods.
Now my age, you see, 70, 79, nearly 79. But still, I sort of meditate, or analytical meditation. So I think every day I meditate. Its impact remains whole day, whole week. So getting older, no hope, that I don't think. whole life, so long, human brain remain there. I think we can develop further. Well, what do you think? As a scientist now.
Yes, so there's no question, Your Holiness, that plasticity is present throughout life. That's the great news. So it persists until we die. And there's good scientific research to show that. So although there are these sensitive periods, there still is plasticity. But Your Holiness, I know that on many occasions you have talked about the importance for you of the affection that you receive from your mother very early on in your life.
That's right.
And that may have set the conditions which then allow you to study and to do the analytic meditation and contemplation once you're older. So that early sense of love and security may be important.
Right. Absolutely right.
Your Holiness, the curriculum and pedagogy that Mind and Life is developing has 3 modes of care. And the very first is this one. We, all of us, have received care. In the early childhood, to remember the care that we have received and to honor and to appreciate that more fully is a way of deepening the appreciation and then the transformation so that we can not only care for ourselves but also ultimately care for others. So these 3 modes of care, of receiving care, self-care, and extending care to others, becomes then a curriculum and pedagogy that can be effective, we think, even at the early ages. I'd like to introduce our second presenter. Diana Chapman-Walsh, of course, is known to you as well. And Diana, I'd like to invite you to speak.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Arthur. I am very happy to be here in this happy fest with Your Holiness in your company again. What a great pleasure it is, as always, to be with you. And this group of intelligent and undoubtedly happy people, buoyed by the clarifying insights that have emerged from the mountains of evidence that our friend Arthur Brooks has amassed and mastered and is spreading across the land. Arthur, your joy and exuberance over the past 2 days, I love. They are really infectious. So thank you very much for having us here. I also need to say that one of the things I've learned from studying Arthur Brooks's writings, including his op-ed piece in the New York Times, is that women are happier than men. So I'm very glad to be here on this stage as the lone representative of the happiest sex. I have come in the spirit of warm-hearted inquiry. Warm-hearted is a word His Holiness uses often and lives. I've come in the spirit of warm-hearted inquiry. I so admire in Your Holiness and have so relished in my encounters with you since joining the Mind and Life Board just 2 years ago. It's been an enormous privilege. Those encounters have demonstrated the power of a particular form of dialogue, and I think we're beginning to nibble at its edges here, a dialogue in which all are invited to come, prepared to learn, and potentially to be changed by respectful engagement with the other, and perhaps to emerge with ideas that are surprisingly new. That kind of discourse requires artfully designed containers with ground rules and touchstones and intentions that welcome honesty and vulnerability based on reciprocity and earned trust. This is a meeting of a less intimate sort, and so I bring questions for now, as you'll see. But perhaps we might hope in time to meet again for the deeper dialogue that moves minds and hearts. I hope so. I want to learn more about how Glenn Hubbard would mend the social safety net. More from Dan Loeb about how we can build on the success of the Success Academy and reintroduce the rule of law into our casino markets. I would like to learn more from John Haidt about his encouraging third story and ask him how deeply are we willing to dig beneath the symptoms into fundamental causes and really, really study the need for profound systems change rather than simply focusing on the symptoms. So thanks to all three of you for your extremely thought-provoking presentations. So my questions, I have many, but I'll just mention two for starters. First, what price do we pay in happiness when we focus too sharply on ourselves? His Holiness has told us that it starts with the self, with the individual, but it doesn't end there. We in the West are so preoccupied with working on ourselves that it becomes almost an end in itself. Could that be a distortion of thought, a psychological grasping, an inner materialism akin to the overheated outward materialism that surrounds us at every turn? What if the fundamental error is to seek happiness through accumulation of any kind, material or psychological? In October, I had the pleasure of participating in one of those Mind and Life Institute dialogues that Arthur described to you in Dharamsala, the home of His Holiness. And we were there with an interdisciplinary group of experts on the topic of craving, desire, and addiction. An underlying problem we learned from the Buddhist scholars who were with us is that our human tendency to fill an uncomfortable emptiness by clinging to thoughts, feelings, things that are inevitably impermanent, as are our lives, is part of our problem. The struggle to come to terms with our mortality is the vulnerability that makes us human. If we seek happiness through acquisition of gadgets, prestige, advantage, then aren't we looking for completion outside of ourselves, seeking a permanence or a perfection that is never ours to attain? Can we learn to be more present to others, including those we most love, without possessing them? Can we love them for who they are, not for who we want them to be? My second question is related to the first. How much of this interest in individual happiness is a sophisticated diversion, a distracting overlay of a simplistic model of social action onto a complex world as we deflect our gaze from frightening signs of instability and danger? I can hardly bear to allow myself to imagine how our children and theirs, my sweet 5-year-old grandson, Sean, will look back years from now and make any sense of this moment in history when we had compelling evidence that we were doing irreparable harm to the Earth's life support systems and yet failed to mobilize to protect their inheritance. The head of MIT's anthropology department, a friend, Susan Silby, explains the error we commonly make when we look to individual agency, choice, and personality as the causal factors in a world that is far more accurately explained by social context, organizational forms and design, culturally structured opportunities and motives. An over-focus on individual cases, she writes, obscures the patterns among them and protects the grand narrative, the story we tell ourselves that our institutions are functioning well enough to meet our needs. From this perspective, as one example, instead of asking how the individual's experience of earned success at work conduces to personal happiness, we would widen the aperture and ask how the birth lottery, the economy, the educational and social structures support or undermine the individual's opportunities to experience earned success. And the panelists just before us alluded to those considerations. Think unemployment, for example, and 30 years of wage stagnation as the weakening of unions has denied workers the opportunity to bargain for decent working conditions and their fair share of the profits of rising productivity. We could argue even, I would assert in this place, that it's the unions, not the free enterprise system, that offer the freedom from wage slavery. Now, I know I won't get an applause for that. Many scholars working to shape what they call a new economy, many of them, and they're quite brilliant, and they are on the margins. They are not in the center of our academic bastions, where I have spent most of my life. They would place my questions squarely at the feet of the American free enterprise system AEI is here to uphold. They are asking, with Canadian economist Mark Anielski, quote, why does the capitalist process and system of economics, accounting, and politics continue to defend or ignore its many forms of social injury and ecological destruction? That's John Haidt's story number 3. I had a list here, a quick list here of some of those injuries or externalities. John spared me having to read it to you. He gave it to you himself. But I think we could say, and maybe he would agree, that Adam Smith might not recognize where we are right now as his version of the system he viewed as moral. If we're going to address these problems, these intertwined problems that we heard described this morning, we will need a new kind of leadership, and that's the second half of what I want to talk about this morning. A different kind of leadership in every sector of society. Next generation leaders who are equal to today's challenges in all their complexity, who are skillful at leading themselves with compassion and equanimity, with love. With love understood as connection, in the way Paul Tillich defined it, the unifying impulse, the recognition of our interweaving with all living beings. The primary message we have been hearing from His Holiness yesterday and today so very clearly, the transformative power of holistic and analytical minds that are informed by warm and inclusive hearts. Love. We'll call it love. Arthur Zients mentioned the Academy for Contemplative and Ethical Leadership that the Mind and Life Institute is beginning to design with strong encouragement from you, Your Holiness. Thank you for that. We held our first planning meeting just 2 weeks ago, and we see the way ahead for a safer and saner future in a leadership that's grounded in connection, in love. We want to explore how to sculpt leaders who are gifted in the ways of community and connection. Can we grow up leaders who lead from within, as Parker Palmer has written, who understand that they have a special responsibility to manage their own inner shadows, lest they cast more shadow than light on those around them? Ah, the rejoinder comes. These are times for muscular leadership. We are told to be afraid, be very afraid, and to place our fate in heroic figures, offering simple comforts. But surely these nervous times call for Einstein's new levels of thinking. The more urgently if we believe that we're entering a period of profound change. What kinds of people do we want leading our vital institutions through historic transformations? How do we want them to lead? What should we expect of leaders we can trust? We'll need leaders who can bridge and balance tensions without collapsing them, can hold contradictions creatively so that they open our minds and our hearts to wider syntheses rather than shutting us down. We'll need leaders that can hold contradictions between power and love. Power without love is reckless and abusive, said Martin Luther King in the last weeks of his life. And love without power is sentimental and anemic. The collision of immoral power with powerless morality constitutes the major crisis of our time. I learned while leading Wellesley College for 14 years that my power, the power of the presidency, existed for the essential purpose of enabling others to find their purpose, their authority, their self-authorship. And I learned that to achieve that, I would have to remain open to others in a way that is the essence of love, as the drive to sustain unity and maintain connection. I would have to respect the other person's reality, the other person's yearning, the other person's path of growth. To be open to influence back from others and their different realities. And this, in turn, taught me the value of diversity as a resource for learning. I learned to hold another tension there, too. This one was even harder. To honor my inner life in the face of all that was swirling around me. It took time and concerted effort to hone the skills to manage external realities and yet maintain a quality of attention in the present that could enfold past and future, embrace complexity, and help me try to meet each moment with equanimity. I didn't always succeed at this, far from it, but I learned to find my way back when I was lost and to know this quality of mindful presence as a capacity I wanted for myself and for my leadership team because I wanted it for our students. It's been said that this new generation escaping into social media as their world spins out of control is being raised on information without context, butter without bread, craving without longing. And yet we have good evidence, as solid as Richie's evidence, that today's youth are longing for more nourishing fare. The disciplines they will need in the years ahead are the ones we will all need, and they are a life's work, never fully mastered, always requiring conscious cultivation. We'll need the strength to stare down our demons of fear and despair so that we can engage the world with curiosity, opening our minds and freeing ourselves of regret, recrimination, and the defeat of shame and blame. We'll need to hear and tolerate the diversity within ourselves, to recognize our own inner voices, their cacophony in there, our own inner voices and identities and moods, to notice how fluid and ephemeral they are, so that we can see and appreciate differences in others and use the practice of self-discovery to move beyond ourselves. We'll need to move beyond dualities, beyond either or, and even beyond the simple corrective of both and. Move to true multiplicities of seeing and of knowing, multiple lenses that acknowledge how competing language games and inequalities of power create lived realities that never even intersect unless we stretch ourselves to try to bring them together. And as we stretch, perhaps, finally, we may find our path to happiness in our immense capacity as humans, under the right conditions, the ones of which His Holiness has spoken for his whole life. Our immense capacity as humans to find and awaken the best in ourselves and in one another, radiating outward in widening circles of compassion and care to the 7 billion human beings you hold in your heart, Your Holiness, and all the living beings with whom we share this planet. Thank you.
Your Holiness, Diana Chapman Walsh has spoken about a new kind of leadership, a leadership that really is directed towards our future, a future which, on the one hand, is filled with possibilities and positive possibilities. On the other hand, also filled with dangers and jeopardy. You yourself have been a leader of a people, your country. You've been a spiritual leader for your monastic community. And you have become a kind of leader for the world community as a whole. Is there some way you could speak out of your experience of a leader who's combined these three elements in a way that might be of some value as we go forward? New leadership. I know you're a simple monk.
Actually, most part of my sort of life in exile as a refugee. So in a way, simpler.
Really?
I think.
Okay.
India is our now second home, last now nearly 55 years. So the government of India, very, very helpful, is very supportive. So then my own case,
things that I need to do.
Of course, you see appeared in early period, you see, sometimes you see people a little bit sort of demoralized, so they give
Tibetan Islam.
Tibetan encouragement. So I usually just say self-confidence is something very, very important. I often use it telling my story. One time in South Africa, the Soweto
Township.
town, you see, I met a local black family. So there, one young African, a black African, he joined that family and conversation. He introduced himself as a teacher. Then, as I always, because of the talking, the Africans, I mentioned, now you already got free democracy, equal. The Constitution now gives you that. And now you mentally, emotionally, you see, should develop. Oh, we are same. Where is the white people, you see, can't, because of that.
Reach now.
Can reach. The black people also can reach. So some kind of self-confidence and hard work was very important. I just mentioned that. Then he responded, oh, difficult. We black people, our brain is inferior. So we cannot sort of compete them. And I felt very sad. If that kind of mental attitude remains, they never can be equal. So self-confidence is so important. Then I explained him, no, if you ask one scientist, brain specialist, any differences, brain, because of difference of color.
Race,
Nobody say, our brain, 100% same. And then I also mentioned our own case. Like that. When we have the opportunity, you see, we can be equal with everyone, anyone. Like and then a lot of sort of talk, explain. Then finally, with
a sigh of relief.
Then he said, oh, now he convinced we are same. So that moment, I really feel because of the tremendous
sense of relief.
Sense of relief. At least I helped, you see, to change one person's mind and develop inner self-confidence, inner strength. So the self-confidence is very, very important. Quite often you see poor people, outwardly, you see, of course, big differences, the richer family or richer community and the poorer. But if you look inward, same ability, same potential. So you see, with self-confidence and hard work. In India or in Africa, so whenever I talk with poorer section of people, I always emphasize, you also have the same potential. Work hard. So early period, I simply, you see, they give some kind of encouragement. And then of course, maybe a little bit of the vision right, right from the beginning, you see, many Tibetan refugees, you see, they are expecting within a few years can return. Then I telling them, no, we should not think that way. I usually use it telling, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Is something very important. So we carry it that way. Then, now, 55 years passed. New Tibetan refugee generations
Emerge.
emerge. Second generation, now third generations. See, we have sort of separate sort of Tibetan settlement and a separate Tibetan school. All is helped by Indian government. So now, refugee community, as a refugee community, we quite well established. So then, meantime, right from the beginning, I fully committed about the promotion of democracy. Since my childhood, you see, our old system, something wrong and outdated. So we must sort of change that. Not just the decision, change by decision will not work. So step by step, work for democratization. Since 1960s, we start. Then 2011, 2000. 2001, 2001, Marbe. We already achieved elected political leadership. Then my position is semi-retired position. Then 2011, I now completely retired from political responsibility. So, in meantime, so I take sort of the responsibility. Sort of, I take sort of a lot of sort of the effort to educate younger Tibetan. You see, our sort of 1,000-year-old our knowledge, which come from India, knowledge tradition. I quite often use it challenging. You see, some Western author used to describe Tibetan Buddhism as Lamaism. It's totally wrong, out of their ignorance. And half, I think the Tibetans themselves, you see, in the public way, in the popular level, they very much sort of respect Lama. Not much sort of differences about their knowledge. So I think the impression of Tibetan, too much emphasis, the importance of Lama, not study. So I think the people eventually got the impression Tibetan Buddhism is something like Lamaism. So Lama have the final authority. Lama have some kind of freedom. That's totally wrong. So that's why I always describe myself as a simple Buddhist monk, just one of the Buddhist monk. According to our sort of monastic system, 253 rules, right? 253 precepts. All monk, no exception, Dalai Lama, have to follow. Same way. And study, rigorous study. I think yesterday I mentioned, because I have the sort of name Dalai Lama, remain in the ceremony, I remain on throne. But as far as my study is concerned, same. So my tutor keep weep. No exception as a Dalai Lama or reincarnation of Chenrezig. They treated me like lazy student. I think very good. So therefore, I really emphasis study, rigorous study. Traditionally, 20, 30 years study. Memorize the most sort of important root text. Then explain each word according to the commentary. Again, is the Indian wrote by Indian masters. So that knowledge, now I notice, as far as Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist concept is concerned, I think a Tibetan study is best. I think we kept, intact over 1,000 years, the knowledge of Nalanda. So I asked this, my longtime friend, you say, whether my brain, something useful or sufficient sharpness or not. All these come from, you see, Tibetan study, which come from Nalanda. Yesterday also I mentioned it. You see, skepticism, not easily accept. Analyze, and look various factors that automatically develop holistic view. That brings realistic sort of view. Realistic view, then carry realistic action. Then a satisfactory result come. So these I felt very, very useful, and also there is some potential, can make a little contribution for well-being of humanity. Never thinking conversion, never thinking sort of propagating Buddha Dharma. I think our last many years, I never sort of mentioned about next life or certain Buddhist concept. We simply discussing about mind, about emotion, and how to deal this. Clear? So part of Buddhist science, not Buddhism, Buddhist religion. So right from the beginning, some concerned people, use the word dialogue between Buddhism and modern science. And I say, no, this is wrong word. So our dialogue is science which come from Buddhist literature. So we can call Buddhist science or ancient Indian science and modern science dialogue. Science, not religion, not faith. So I think I may, because I think because of the mention maybe, out of 300 volumes, which actually are text. So I divided. First, I felt the content of these 300 volumes, we can divide 3 parts: science, matters, and minds, or external world or internal world. That part is science. Not talking positive or negative. Simply, what is this reality that we can treat as a science? Then on that basis, Buddhist concept of impermanence, concept of interrelated or relativeness, these things. That's Buddhist concept of Buddhist philosophy. On that basis, Buddhist practice, training of mind, is to come. That part is Buddhist religion. So philosophy, no, science and philosophy and religion. As far as now science is concerned, now last about 3 years, because of compiling.
Now we're creating a compendium from the classical Indian sources.
So now that already now completed, almost completed. So March we will finalize. Then immediately we start to translate. Translation, English translation, Hindi translation, Chinese translation. Then many of our friends, Mongolians, Koreans, and Vietnamese, they also say ready, to translate, and Russian, like that. So therefore, that's my main job.
That's your main job.
Not sort of political thing or administration right from the beginning. The appointed person, they carry.
Yeah.
If I carry the administration, I think everything,
everything will be confused.
I think your thoughts are clear.
Otherwise, that's the commitment. Go to different countries, different places, and showing my teeth. That's all. One time, the vice president, later is the Indian president, become president, the Kasa, Dr. Radhakrishna. Very good scholar, and modern education in Oxford, educated, and also great philosopher. So one time, you see, we together, you see, looking some picture, and everybody is smiling. Then he mentioned, we are appetizing our teeth. He mentioned that. So that's one of my job, like that. I think that job also, you see, quite useful. That job brings more friends, more smiles from others. Except in some cases, in Germany, I want to share with you, see, as a joke. You see, one time in Germany, you see, one function, I'm going there. Then, you see, because I was in the car. Of course, as by my nature, whenever I see someone, I always smile. So that particular day, one quite young lady is coming. As usual, I smile. I think that lady got some suspicion. Why this strange person in the car? This dress is something strange. So smiling. So I think she may got some suspicion and distrust. So she looks very negative way. Then I also turn. So not necessarily, because not very sure. You see, give smile. Sometimes negative response. Otherwise, it's basically even animal showing sincerity. Animal, poor animal, no intelligence, very limited intelligence. They also respond.
Thank you, Your Holiness.
So only question, since many years, whether mosquito have the ability to show appreciation or not. Still, this question still remains.
Mosquito.
So, mosquito. I think more than 20 years. I ask quite often, you see some scientists. One occasion in Oxford. One great because the scientists or philosophers, because of the professors in front line. So I asked them. Nobody answered. So now this is your work. You see, the tiny insect, which level, the brain size, you see, have the ability to
show appreciation.
To show, you see, appreciation. That's still, I don't know. So answer must come from you.
We'll get busy working on it.
So you have to sacrifice more insects. Insects are life, isn't it? To experiment.
So if I summarize.
Okay. Thank you. So sorry, I'm wasting your time. Sorry.
Not at all. I think concerning leadership, endurance, self-confidence, study, clarity of thought, and good teeth.
What a good thing. And the bald head.
Well, I'd like to pull our final presenter into the hilarity. Otto Scharmer, why don't you join us by presenting your thoughts, which will include thoughts concerning leadership and what it's called for. Thank you.
Your Holiness, Arthur, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to express my deep appreciation for being part of this conversation this morning. And I would like to add a few remarks on the beginning convergence of leadership, systems thinking, and mindfulness that we can observe in many areas today. I'm an action researcher at MIT. I spent the last 20 years of my professional work in the context of organizational learning, innovation, and change. And during that time, I had the possibility to work in a lot of on-the-ground change projects across cultures and sectors. And also had the opportunity to do research projects, among others, kind of interviewing 150 thought leaders on innovation, leadership, and change. And many of them were practitioners. So listening to, to the practitioners and listening to the experiences in the field, I would like to summarize my own learnings from that with 4 simple points that I would like to add to the conversation this morning. The first one is that there are 2 different sources of learning. Learning from the past and learning from the emerging future. Learning by leaning into, sensing and actualizing emerging future possibilities. And when you look into my field, organizational learning, almost all the methodologies and all the kind of best practices that are done in consulting companies and so forth are based on the first learning model, the experiential learning model, which is basically learning by reflecting on the experience of the past. However, in working with leaders in business, government, and civil society, I noticed that more often than not, leaders are facing challenges that you cannot address just by reflecting on the experiences of the past. Sometimes the experience of the past that we have are not very useful. Sometimes the experience of the past that we have in a team, for example, is the very obstacle to come up with a new way of framing a situation. So that then led the question to me, is there a second source of learning? Learning by sensing, leaning into, and then actualizing emerging future possibilities? And if yes, how does it work? Which leads me to my second point, and leads me to the process that I have seen being at work when these situations, learning from the emerging future, happen. So in order to sense, lean into, and actualize emerging future possibilities, leaders have to engage in a process that is moving through the following 3 stages. 1, after clarifying your intention, observe, observe, observe. Kind of go into a deep immersion journey where you go to the stakeholders and the places that can teach you most about the situation, and listen with your mind and heart wide open. Number 2, everyone coming back and sharing what they experienced, and then retreat and reflect. Allow the inner knowing to emerge. Kind of synthesize everything that you heard and connect that with your own deeper senses of knowing, with who you are and what the kind of change or what's the kind of story we want to be part of. And then when the spark or an inspiration of the future shows up, number 3, act in an instant. So not putting it into a long time planning process, but exploring the future by doing through rapid, small-scale experiments that generate feedback from other stakeholders. The third thing that I learned is that to do that well, for leaders to do that well, leaders have to engage in a new type of leadership work, which is an inner cultivation work, by cultivating 3 inner instruments of knowing, which are the open mind, the open heart, and the open will. What I mean with open mind is the capacity to suspend our habits of judgment and to look at the situation with fresh eyes. What I mean with open heart is the capacity to empathize, the capacity of looking at the situation not from my angle, but from the view of other stakeholders in that situation. And what I mean with open will is the capacity to access the deep creative and entrepreneurial core that is dormant in every single human being. Your Holiness, you were yesterday you said action is more important than praying and blessing. So this process that, that I just outlined is basically trying to link these three by kind of linking contemplation, observation with rapid cycle action. There are many leaders today that, or there are several leaders today that embody these principles. Steve Jobs is who has been a practitioner, a mindfulness practitioner himself, is well known kind of for his claim that the only way to do our best work is by following your heart. Do what you love and love what you do. Another leader I learned a great deal from, the late CEO of Hanover Insurance, Bill O'Brien, kind of summarized his own kind of transformation, change experience as a CEO with the following sentence. He said, "The success of an intervention depends on the interior condition of the intervener." So what he meant is the success of what I do as a leader, as a change maker, depends on the inner place from that I'm operating. Depends on the quality of attention and intention that I bring into a situation. One leader that I see also greatly embodying these principles is Eileen Fisher, the founder and CEO of Eileen Fisher, a very successful women's clothing company, who not only, like Steve Jobs, is kind of using practices, cultivation practices herself as an individual, but who also, like Twitter co-founder Evan Williams kind of does in his company, introduces kind of mindfulness practices on an organizational level. So in Eileen Fisher, every single business meeting is at the beginning, there is a moment of mindfulness. So it's not too long, it's maybe just a minute, and it gives everyone in that meeting the possibility to connect with the present moment, with my own experience, and with what we are here for to do together, with my own intentions. My fourth and final point comes back, Your Holiness, to your various remarks yesterday and today when you talked about the larger situation, the global crisis situation we are in. Diana also talked about that earlier, and other at the earlier panel, kind of other co-panelists. And you said everything is interrelated. And you also said that taking care of others is the best thing also for ourselves, for our own future. So it's not really an alternative. So my fourth and final point relates to the global pressing challenges that we face as a community today. I have been, over the past few years, been involved in multi-stakeholder work in education, in health, in business, in sustainability. And from my experience, the key leadership challenge in all these projects, in all these huge, in part very large multi-stakeholder projects, is the same. And it begins with the fact that no single organization, be it government or business, can solve the big challenges that we face in education, health, and so on alone. So we have a collaboration challenge, really. And in all these systems, what we need to do as leaders is something very simple, which is we need to bring together all the key stakeholders, including business, government, civil society, and we need to move them through a process where they begin to make sense of the larger situation together, identify some of the key systemic issues that we need to address, develop kind of a vision and intention of better ways of operating, and then exploring that and small-scale, hands-on prototypes where we can learn from experience and then scale what's working. So what I'm saying here is, Richie, you were talking about neuroplasticity this morning. And when you said that, I thought, well, what is really the leadership challenge today? Leaders are the stewards of the neuroplasticity of the collective brain. Kind of that, should be switched on in terms of the collaborative opportunities that we need today across all the silos that our kind of current way of institutionalizing things has created. And that's really, I believe, kind of the core leadership challenge that we face, kind of how what we can do to be good stewards of switching on of activating the neuroplasticity of the collective field of collaboration and interaction that we have. So there are many examples of that, including kind of the Sustainable Food Lab here in America with over 70 companies. In Africa, in a project that significantly improved maternal health with all the stakeholders in Namibia, and also kind of in Southeast Asia around the Coral Triangle Initiatives, which is convening hundreds of stakeholders from all three sectors to address the biodiversity and the marine sustainable fishing and food security challenges in the region and globally. And so in summing up, and in all these challenges, the fundamental challenge for leaders is the same, which is to move a system that currently interacts based on ecosystem awareness, which is a narrow definition of ecosystem awareness, that I'm only aware of my own kind of view of the situation, to a different way of operating where the interaction and the collaboration is based on a shared ecosystem awareness. And with ecosystem awareness, I mean an awareness that is focusing not only on my own well-being, but also on the well-being of all other stakeholders in the system. That, in my view, is the key leadership challenge today, and decides is the causal factor that determines the success, the quality of results that we generate in these systems. So in summing up, I tried to make 3 points. The first one is that there are two different sources of learning. Learning from reflecting the past and learning by sensing, leaning into and actualizing emerging future possibilities. Secondly, leaders, in order to activate the second type of learning, need to cultivate 3 new leadership capacities: the open mind, mindfulness, paying attention to our attention; the open heart, compassion; and the open will, which is activating the deeper creative and entrepreneurial core that is dormant in every human being. So, and the last one, the last point is that the number one leadership challenge, in my view, today is to shift the field of interaction from the current mode that is mainly based on ecosystem awareness, or a narrow definition of that, to one that's more based on a shared awareness of the whole, and that is designed to create results that address the key challenges that we face as a community today. Your Holiness, my question to you is this. So we have seen many great examples of benefits applying the power of mindfulness and compassion as individuals. And yes, that's where the starting point is. But what we also see today is that we face major challenges that require to use the power of mindfulness and compassion also on a systems level, on kind of how we evolve the system as a whole. And I would be just very interested in your view, your thoughts, or your experience in that.
대내 다 내주망 보지 지소의 대외 되고 다 지소 주소부터네 대만야샤다 니지 로장베토네 대래야 슈켄 대야가 답시 가려놨어.
I think you know better. You already have experience. So my thinking is we are emphasizing the education. So that's the fundamental sort of the approach. I think people who never sort of experience these things, then all of a sudden, you see, they pursue them, do that. They're a burden.
It becomes a burden.
So, through education, I think like you see, they taking care one's own sort of physical
health.
For example, health. For example, the exercise or these things. From childhood, they sort of learn that, and then that become part of their habit. So these things, I think, should start, as you mentioned, from young age. That also not sort of something like imposing, but for their own interest. Even day-to-day life, the student, you see, sort of with these sort of experience, much happier. Even among students, some quarrel, a few moments, fight, then forget. Isn't it? So you see, the student themselves, you see
the benefit.
See the benefit. So through that way, then grown, then eventually, you see, enter the society, and getting job, and eventually become leadership. Then I think real effect come. Otherwise, I don't know. Pockets here and here. I don't know.
Thank you.
So you know better. You're the best.
It's my impossible task to pull this all together in just a few seconds, really. You know, we've come together across extraordinary divides. We've come from the left, we've come from the right, we've come from the world of science, the world of contemplative spirituality, from the world of leadership and organizational and systems redesign and reimagination. And we've entered into a heartfelt and fully open dialogue. To me, this is a kind of politics of compassion that does not recognize party lines, individual differences, but recognizes that we all care about each other. We care about this planet that supports our good life. You know, Mind and Life, and I'm sure AEI, and many people who may be hearing this from around the world on the web stream, are also united in this commitment and conviction to truly care for each other and for our world, to practice a politics of compassion as opposed to one of division and argumentation. So it's been a great pleasure and privilege to be part of this conversation. Just as one sets an intention at the beginning of a practice so that it may be fruitful, not only for oneself, but for others, that selflessness, I always think one should practice gratitude and dedication at the end of such a practice. And perhaps this dialogue, we can also be grateful to Arthur Brooks and his staff for generously hosting this, to those sponsors who supported it, and of course to you, Your Holiness, for the courage and the inspiration to speak to all communities, to, even as a Marxist, to join us here, to learn something about capitalism, to critique, to practice that dialogue with respect and good heart. And Arthur Brooks, I'd love to invite you up here to close the session for us as well.
Thank you, Arthur. And thanks to all of you. One person that we haven't had a chance to show a little bit of gratitude is Dr. Jinpa, the wonderful translator for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We've reached the end of our session, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama is off to bless others for the rest of the day today. As we close out the session, please just take a quick moment to stay seated as he leaves the stage. And I do want to reiterate what Arthur just said to all of you. The founding principle of the American Enterprise Institute is that the competition of ideas is fundamental to a free society. We learned here today from His Holiness the Dalai Lama and our wonderful colleagues, new colleagues from the Mind and Life Institute, that to consider differing ideas with an open mind and a warm heart is a real virtue, and it's a blessing to all of us. This is important because we've also learned some of the secrets to happiness. The secrets to happiness lie within, according to His Holiness and according to the scientific evidence, but we can also improve happiness in our lives and in the lives of other people through visionary institutions and visionary public policy. This is what we are dedicated to mutually. And I think that the most important point of all is the blessings that we all receive today. The blessings that we receive from open dialogue, the blessings that we receive from the human solidarity that's completely apparent in this room and that will continue as we leave today, and the blessing most of all from the wisdom of the most wonderful man that we have met in so much time, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Please join me in thanking His Holiness as we thank all of you and say God bless you and thank you.